What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, then I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Today's episode, I'm going to be talking about periodization. Now, a lot of athletes have probably heard of this term before, and obviously most coaches are going to be familiar with periodization and what it entails. But the purpose of this episode today is to discuss a little bit about periodization and what it actually is, some of the different approaches to periodization or periodizing a training plan. There's a few different approaches out there, and each of them kind of serves a different purpose, or you can use them in different situations to accomplish different things. And then also just talk a little bit about some of the science behind periodization and what some recent research tends to point towards or suggest in terms of how to use periodized training plans versus a non-periodized approach. And so while most coaches are going to be hopefully at least fairly familiar with what periodization is and how to actually periodize a training plan, this might be something that most athletes are relatively unfamiliar with, as it's something that you wouldn't necessarily learn about unless you were taking some kind of exercise science or exercise physiology course, whether it's like through an undergrad degree or whether you were getting some type of strength and conditioning or personal training type certification. So if you're an athlete who coaches yourself, you've probably never learned about periodization and what it is and what some of the science suggests regarding periodization. So the purpose of this podcast is to just very briefly dive into this topic or concept. Now, it's a very complex topic, and there is decades and decades of research that's been published on this specific topic, and it's a topic that spans across not only endurance sport but just sport as a whole. So it could be strength and power athletes, it could be team sport athletes, or it could be endurance sport athletes. Periodization is essentially the most commonly accepted approach to structuring a training plan for any athlete, as opposed to a non-periodized plan, which is essentially an unstructured plan, and I'll get into some definitions here in a minute. But this podcast is probably going to be more insightful for the self-coached athlete, as it's going to cover some of the basics of what periodization is. But if you're a coach, don't stop listening or don't tune out yet, because there will be some things in here that are probably interesting for you as well, especially when I start discussing some of the science behind periodization and what it suggests, and then what are some of the practical applications of that science. But before I get into some of the more recent science discussing periodization, let's first dive into what periodization is and what are some of the basics of it. So essentially, when you think of periodization, you want to think of systematic and planned variation in a training plan, essentially is kind of how I would define it. And there's obviously a few different technical definitions floating around there in the research literature. But it's essentially any systematic planned variation to a training approach is what periodization could be defined as. And it's essentially the opposite of an unstructured and random plan. So just to give you a couple examples so that you can put this into the context of what it looks like visually. So a non-periodized plan would be something that's random, right? So it would be the athlete who is going out there and they have no plan going into each week or each month or each year. They just kind of wake up and they do what they want, right? So they might wake up one day and they want to run really hard, so they run hard that day. The next day they're tired, so they wake up and they just do something very easy and light. Or let's just say it's the athlete who they just do the same thing all the time. This could be another type of unstructured approach to training, in which, let's just say the athlete has the exact same routine that they do Monday through Sunday. Let's say they're a runner, and they run by themselves 5 days a week, and then they have 2 group workouts that they do. Maybe it's like a track workout on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and then they have like a group long run on the weekend. And there's no rhyme or reason to what they do or why they do. It's just the same thing every week. That could also be another example of a non-periodized approach to training. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a periodized approach to training is essentially something that's structured and it has systematic variation in the training variables to accomplish a specific purpose. So, typically the types of variables that you can manipulate would be the training frequency, which would be the number of sessions per week that you're doing, the training volume, which could be looked at in terms of duration or mileage or yardage, depending on the sport that you're doing, training intensity, and you can measure intensity with heart rate, power, pace. Those are probably the three most common ways of measuring it. And then the training mode or the method. So, for example, if you're a swimmer, you could go swim in the pool. You could do open water swimming. You could swim on like a Vasa trainer, which is kind of like a stationary indoor swim type simulation approach. So there's different modes. And if you're running, it could be on the treadmill, it could be on the trails, it could be on the road. Cycling could be road cycling, mountain biking, gravel biking. Obviously, you get the point. There's different modes for each activity that you could choose between. So those are the variables that we can manipulate. Now, periodization aims to manipulate those variables in a strategic and planned manner to accomplish a specific purpose. So typically, a periodized plan is built around a couple key races each year or each season. And then you kind of work backwards from there to plan out your year or your season to peak for certain races. And then you go through different training blocks that have different focuses, or foci, I guess. And then you would peak at a certain time and then taper into certain races. And that's kind of what periodization is in general. So obviously, if you're an athlete who's worked with a coach, you've probably experienced a periodized plan, hopefully. And there's really not necessarily one right or wrong way of doing it. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but a periodized plan is always going to be better than a non-periodized plan, but it might not necessarily matter what approach to periodization a coach takes. As long as it has some kind of systematic and planned focus and variation in the training structure, then it's going to be better than just a random plan. So among those variables that you can manipulate, oftentimes they'll change from week to week, month to month, and then season to season, depending on the type of goal that you want to accomplish. So typically when we talk about periodization, there are three different kind of scientific or specific terms that we use to break down a year or a season. So at the most broad scope, we have a macro cycle, which is typically like the season or the big yearly block. So I typically like to think of it in terms of like a yearly block or a season. So it's like a 6 to 12 month plan. So if you have, let's just use a triathlete for the purpose of this example. Let's say we have a triathlete who's looking to accomplish completing their first Ironman, and it's about a year away. So their macro cycle would be that year leading up to that Ironman, which would be their A race. So you could classify the macro cycle in this example as a 12-month plan. Then we start to work backwards and we start to narrow our scope of focus. And we move from the macro cycle of the periodization plan, which is the 12-month plan, and we move to the mesocycles. Now, mesocycles are typically 1 to 2 month focused blocks of training, and the focus of those blocks is going to vary depending on the time of year, where you are in the season, and how close you are to your key races. So we might break down this macro cycle for this athlete, the 12-month plan, into 1 or 2 month focused blocks of training in which each block has a different focus. Now that focus, I won't get into the specifics, but the focus of those blocks is going to change as the athlete progresses closer and closer to that A race or that key race at the end of the plan, which would be their Ironman. So just as a very, very general example, they might start off building very, very general and basic fitness at the very beginning, and they might just be doing the majority of their training volume at very low or easy intensities to build an aerobic base. And then they might start adding in some intensity after a few months or after a few blocks. And maybe they start adding in some very, very short, sharp, high intensity efforts to develop the very, very high end of their anaerobic capacity, like their really short sprint capacity and their VO2 max. And then they might start working on their threshold midway through the year, as they start to get closer and closer to their Ironman. And then in the background, obviously, they're always working on their aerobic engine, their aerobic capacity. But they start to add on a little bit more intensity as they get closer and closer to their Ironman. And then maybe a couple months out from their Ironman, once they've kind of worked on developing, say, their short sprint capacity, and then eventually their VO2 max, and then they started working on their threshold for a while. Now they've had 6, 7, 8, 9 months of building a really good base of an aerobic, of their aerobic endurance through a lot of really easy mileage. And then they've also worked on developing things like their threshold and their VO2 max. So they've developed some of the higher ends of their fitness. Now they need to take all that fitness that they've built a few months out and start to translate it into race-specific fitness or Ironman-specific fitness. So they might work on that for the last couple months. And then about 2 to 3 weeks out from race day, they've peaked, hopefully, and then they start to taper leading into race day. So they've accomplished the macro cycle, which is the 12-month plan, and then the mesocycle are those 1 to 2 month blocks where the focus changes each time you transition from one block to the next. Now, getting even more granular in our scope or focus, we move from macro cycle, which is the 12-month plan, from the mesocycle, which is the 1 to 2 month blocks, to the microcycles, which are typically like a weekly block or what the athlete is doing on a 7 to 14 day basis. And that's about as granular of a focus as we get. And that might look different from week to week for some athletes. So for example, let's say we have the macro cycle planned out, which is our 12-month plan. We have all of our blocks, our 1 to 2 month blocks planned out. Now we want to plan out what our actual week to week is going to look like. So let's just say we want to go through a build for 2 to 3 weeks and then recover every third or fourth week. Now we start to structure out some of those week to week fluctuations in the training structure. And let's just say that most amateur and age group athletes tend to function on like the Monday through Sunday type schedule because it just works best with their work and with their family. So most athletes will tend to function on like a Monday through Sunday training cycle. But on the other end of the spectrum, there might be some professional athletes that function on like a 10-day rotating training cycle, or like a 12-day rotating training cycle, because they don't necessarily need to subscribe to like the typical Monday through Sunday because they might not be working Monday through Friday. Whereas age groupers and amateurs, they might have to do less volume during the week and then layer on a little bit more volume on the weekend when they're not working. So that's how you kind of break down a periodized plan, and you start to work backwards from your key race, developing the macro cycle, what the big focus is, breaking it down even further into the mesocycles, which are those smaller blocks of about 1 to 2 months where you have a specific focus or something that you're trying to develop within those blocks. And then you break it down even further to the most granular scope, which is the microcycles. And that's essentially what you're doing on a week-to-week basis or like a 10-day cycle basis. And that's kind of periodization in a nutshell. And obviously that's very, very general and generic and surface level. Again, entire like chapters of textbooks can be written on this topic. So this is obviously just some surface level basics. But that's essentially periodization in a nutshell. Again, it's any kind of like systematic planned approach to training in which you break it down into macrocycles, mesocycles, and microcycles. Now, there are different approaches to periodization, and I'm going to cover some of those here in a minute. But first, I want to start diving into some of the science as to periodized training plans versus non-periodized training plans. Now, some might argue, well, what's the benefit of periodizing a plan versus just going out and doing random training all the time, right? Well, we tend to know, especially from recent research, that having a periodized approach or a structured approach to training tends to be superior to a non-periodized or random approach to training. And so I'm going to talk about one study here that highlights that nicely in terms of how it relates to running or endurance athletes. But in this specific study, it was with runners, and they were looking at run-specific outcomes. So this study was actually done in 2020. And essentially what they did is they had 3 different groups of runners. So they got 30 runners, and they put 10 runners in each group. Group number 1 was a linear periodization approach, and I'm going to talk about what linear periodization is, as well as some of the other approaches here in a bit. But group 1 was a linear periodization approach, which is essentially going from high volume, low intensity, and working their way up as the weeks progress to lower volume, higher intensity. Group number 2 was a reverse linear periodization group, which is the opposite of that. So they started with low volume, high intensity approach, working their way up to higher volume, lower intensity approach. And then group number 3 was an unstructured, non-periodized control group. So 10 runners in each group. Group 1 was one periodization approach. Group 2 was a different periodization approach. And then group 3 was just a control group in which they said, just keep doing the training that you've been doing. And that training tended to be random, unstructured, non-periodized. The study went on for 14 weeks. And essentially how it looked was the periodization groups had 2 supervised treadmill run sessions each week and then 1 unsupervised run session each week. So a total of 3 running sessions each week. And then the non-periodized training group, or the control group, obviously just did their training that they had been doing up to that point. They continued onward with that. And then the researchers measured at baseline, midpoint, which is week 7, and then post-intervention, which would be week 14, their VO2 max, their running economy at a submaximal running speed, and then their 5K time trial. Now, the findings were kind of interesting. So we saw improvements across all groups in VO2 max and running economy, which you might expect even with a non-periodized approach. And it kind of depends on the training status of the athlete, but just training in general, you're still going to see some type of improvement. And so it wasn't a surprise maybe that we saw improvements in VO2 max and running economy across all 3 groups. But only the periodized groups improved their 5K time trial. Now, the structured training sessions that the periodized group had tended to be focused on improving their 5K specific time trial. And so it probably isn't a surprise that we saw the periodized groups improve their 5K time trial when compared to the control group, because the control group was just doing kind of random training. And now this study isn't the only study to necessarily demonstrate superiority of periodized training as compared to a non-periodized approach to training. Many other studies over the years have looked at periodized training approaches versus non-periodized training approaches, and just keeping it in the context of endurance athletes, what we tend to see across the majority of these studies that have been done is that a periodized approach tends to be better than a non-periodized approach. Now, a couple things to keep in mind here. So a lot of this depends on, so the outcomes that you're going to see in an athlete depend on a variety of different factors. So one of the big ones that comes to mind is the training status of an athlete. So let's say we have an endurance athlete who's brand new to their sport. Let's just say that they're getting into running and they've never done running before as like a competitive endurance athlete. Now that novice or beginner runner, no matter the approach that they take, whether it's a really well-designed periodized approach or whether it's an unstructured random approach to training, just getting out the door and doing something, whether it's structured or not, is going to elicit improvements. Now where a periodized approach really starts to demonstrate its superiority over an unstructured or non-periodized approach is in more seasoned athletes that are training and racing year-round for years on end, and they're training specifically to improve their race performance. So for like the average kind of weekend warrior athlete, or even just someone who's going out there and running for just say general health and fitness, a periodized approach probably isn't necessarily applicable to them for the most part, because they're not necessarily training year in, year out, trying to incrementally improve their performance over time and maximize those adaptations at the same time. They're just kind of going out there and running for the joy of it, or just a few times a week to maintain some general health, wellness, and fitness. Now the periodized approach is going to be superior over the non-periodized approach for the athlete as they start to become more seasoned and as they start to get more and more competitive and more trained. That's where having systematic planned variation in training variables over the course of years and years is really going to start to add up, and you're going to see the benefits in terms of their fitness improvements and then their race times and their performances year in and year out. And so there's obviously some things to keep in mind here when you're interpreting the findings of these studies, but what we do tend to see in general is that a periodized approach elicits greater improvements in certain outcomes over a non-periodized approach. And so typically over the decades, we've come to accept that having a periodized approach for competitive athletes that are training and racing year in, year out is typically going to be best over a unstructured, non-periodized approach. And one of the main benefits of having a periodized approach is that it's systematic and it's planned, right? So you're going to not only hopefully maximize the adaptations that you see in the long term, but you're also going to reduce, like I said, the risk for things such as burnout, overtraining, overuse injury, things like that. Because if you are an athlete who just takes the non-periodized route and you have a very unstructured and random approach to training, you could get caught in the habit of doing the same thing week in, week out for really, really long periods of time, which could potentially lead into psychological or physical burnout. Or if you're training too hard too often and you're doing that for month on top of month on top of month, that could also potentially lead to things such as burnout or overuse injury or overtraining. So it's usually best to have some type of structure or planned variation in your training. And that's essentially just periodizing a training plan, is having a systematic and planned approach to training. And this tends to work well too for endurance athletes that are racing consistently throughout the year, because you obviously want to peak for bigger races or certain key races, and knowing how to systematically plan a training plan on a yearly, monthly, and weekly basis is just going to yield much better results for those key races, as opposed to just going out there and randomly training at will and doing whatever you want on the days where you feel like doing it. So periodization is obviously superior to an unstructured approach in the context that the athlete is usually like some kind of competitive athlete, or they're training month in, month out on a yearly basis, and they're looking to improve their fitness and their performance over time. Now, getting into some of the different periodization approaches. So we obviously know that a periodized approach is superior to a non-periodized approach, and decades of research tends to back that up. Again, regardless of the sport that you're doing, whether it's endurance sport, team sport, a strength or a power-based sport, typically periodizing your training plan is going to yield better results than a non-periodized approach. But what type of periodization approach should you take? Now, this is where it can get a lot more complex, and where entire chapters of textbooks can be written on this topic. And this is something that I definitely won't be able to cover, so that everyone listening to this understands it and comprehends it fully within a 30 to 45 minute podcast episode. But just to touch on some of the basics here, and then I'll also be sure to link into the show notes for this episode an article that I wrote recently on this exact same topic. And I published this in our VO2 Max forum, which is on our Peak Endurance Solutions website. And so I'll be sure to link that into the show notes. And then within there are some references and some other resources that you could branch off into to get a more in-depth understanding of periodization, and maybe how to apply periodization to your training approach if you are a self-coached athlete. And then if you're a coach yourself, just refreshing some of these basics as far as periodization goes might be nice for you as well, because maybe it's been a while since you've looked at some of the periodization literature or some of the different periodization approaches that are out there. Might get some of those gears turning, getting you to think about periodization in a different way. And so I will preface this with, I'm going to cover a few different approaches or types of periodization, but we do tend to see there's some research that might show that a certain periodization approach is superior to accomplish a specific outcome over another approach to periodization. But then there's also research that demonstrates that, like the study that I mentioned above, a specific approach to periodization might not necessarily be superior for eliciting a certain approach. So in the study that I was discussing, just a couple of moments ago, they had those 3 groups. One of the groups was a linear periodization approach, which is typically called like a traditional periodization approach. And then the other one was a reverse linear periodization approach. And there was really no difference between those groups in terms of the outcomes that they saw. Both of those groups improved their 5K performance to a large extent, and there wasn't a significant difference between the groups. So in that specific study, it tended to show that periodization was better than non-periodized approach to training, but the linear versus reverse linear periodization groups didn't really see much of a difference. So in that specific case, it didn't really matter which approach you took. It just mattered that you had a periodized approach to training. So as far as some of the different types of periodization go, we'll start with the most common one, which is a traditional periodization approach. And like I mentioned before, this is typically a progression from high volume, low intensity training to lower volume, higher intensity training. Now, if you ever went through like a really basic strength training program growing up, whether in like high school or college, typically you'll follow a traditional periodization approach in which you start off with higher volume, lower intensity. So like maybe 2 or 3 sets of like 12 to 15 reps of a strength training exercise. So higher volume, and then obviously lower weight or lower intensity. And you gradually build your way through to lower volume, but higher intensity. So you might build your way up to doing workouts that are like 3 to 4 sets of like 3 to 6 reps where you're pushing really, really heavy weights. And in endurance sport, that might look something like doing lots and lots of really, really low intensity, easy aerobic efforts and doing high volumes of that with not a lot of intensity, and then eventually progressing your way through over the course of your macro cycle to doing lower volume, but adding in a lot more intensity. And now the opposite of that would be reverse periodization, which is just the reverse of that. So it's starting off with really high intensity and a lot lower training volume, and progressing to higher volume and lower intensity. And then another approach we have is a daily undulating periodization approach. And this one tends to be used a lot more frequently by team sport athletes, in which and it can also be used by some individual sport athletes as well, but it tends to be used when there's like a really long competitive season in which there's competitions that are happening very, very frequently. And the reason that a daily undulating approach works best for some of these athletes during that portion of the year where they're competing all the time is they might need to maintain different aspects of their fitness the best that they can. And so typically with this approach, you'll have variation in the different physiological systems that you're working on a weekly basis or on a daily basis. So you might be working on one specific aspect of fitness on Monday, and then a different aspect of fitness on Wednesday, and then a different one again on Friday. So there's not necessarily like a block of training where you're working on one specific aspect of your fitness like you might be with traditional or even reverse periodization. You tend to focus on a lot of different things within a block over the course of a week, essentially, so that you can maintain all those different aspects of your fitness that you will need to be competitive over the course of like a 3, 4, 5, 6 month competitive season. And then there's weekly undulating periodization, in which the focus changes on a week-to-week basis instead of a day-to-day basis. So you might focus on, let's say VO2 max and maintaining your VO2 max fitness in week 1. And then week 2, you might work on your threshold fitness. And then in week 3, you might just do a lot of volume and really low intensity and just work on building aerobic endurance. And then you'll just rotate through that 3-week cycle. And that would be something that would characterize a weekly undulating periodization. And again, this tends to be used by athletes that have like a really long competitive season in which they need to have really well developed aspects of their fitness that they're just trying to keep sharp on over the course of the competitive season. And so they're just rotating back and forth between all these different aspects of fitness over the course of the season so that they can maintain them to the greatest extent possible. And then another approach is block periodization. And so I've covered 4 approaches so far. This is the 5th approach. And typically you'll see a different number of periodization approaches depending on who you talk to or what piece of research you look at. But typically there are these 5 different approaches. And so the 5th one is block periodization. And this one's a little bit more advanced, and it's something that athletes might use as they become really, really seasoned and they're looking to improve certain aspects of their fitness that are really, really hard to see improvements in when they've been training for such a long period of time. So this one's really common with professional or elite athletes because it takes so much focused attention, energy, and effort to see just marginal improvements in different aspects of their fitness that a block periodization approach tends to work really well because it overloads the system for a week or 2 before they recover. And so it kind of gives them like an overstimulation of whichever aspect of their fitness that they're looking to improve upon before they recover. So with block periodization, they might have, say, like a really, really, really highly focused block that lasts 7 to 14 days in which they overload their body on training to improve a specific aspect of their fitness. So let's just say they're an endurance athlete and they're trying to improve their threshold fitness. Rather than taking like kind of a more traditional approach in which they just have like a month or 2-month block of training where they're just working on it and they're doing maybe 1 or 2 sessions a week that are working on their threshold fitness, they might deviate away from that and do a few different blocks of training where it's just 7 to 14 days of a lot of training sessions or a lot of volume that's focused on developing their threshold fitness, a lot more than you would want to have typically on a month-to-month basis, so that they're in essence overloading their system and then they recover. And then it's that like peak or that spike in loading on their system that's hopefully going to help them adapt. And so that's kind of a block periodization approach. And so again, each of these approaches kind of has its own place. The most common approaches that you're going to see for the majority of athletes and the one that tends to work the best for the majority of like amateur endurance athletes is either a traditional periodization approach or a reverse periodization approach. And these ones work really, really nicely because it allows athletes to kind of gradually build throughout the year towards specific key races that they have, or A races. And so those are the 2 most common approaches you'll see. And then the other 3 approaches, the daily undulating, the weekly undulating, and the block periodization approaches, those are something that you might see in probably more commonly in like team sport athletes or professional athletes that have like really long competitive seasons, or in athletes that are looking to kind of overload their system for short periods of time to see marginal improvements in their fitness that are maybe harder to come by when they're just following traditional periodization approaches. But again, there's not necessarily one best periodization approach that certain athletes have to follow. This is where a little bit of the art of periodization comes in. It's kind of up to the coach or the athlete to choose the approach that makes the most sense based on the types of races or competitions that they're going for and how many they're going for and how they're spaced over the course of a year. But I think one of the important take-home messages here, if I could kind of summarize it in just a few sentences, for coaches and athletes would be that we typically know, or we tend to know, that a periodized approach is better than a non-periodized approach, and we have decades of research to back that up. And that's the science piece of it. Now the art comes in with how do you structure your periodized approach, whether you're a coach or a self-coached athlete. And again, that's where some of the art of it all comes in. And so again, not necessarily one specific approach that you have to take to accomplish your goals, but having a structured and periodized approach to your training is probably going to be superior than just a random, unstructured approach. So again, I go over some of the basics of periodization and how you can maybe begin to start periodizing your training plan in the piece that I wrote in our VO2 Max forum. And so again, I'll be sure to link that into the show notes below so that you can read on some of this stuff in a little bit more depth and detail. And I'll also be sure to link in there my forms of contact. So email is probably the best way to reach me, and that's at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. So if you do have any specific questions on this, you can reach out to me through that form of contact. But otherwise, that's really what I wanted to accomplish in today's episode, was just touching on some of the basics of periodization, what some recent science tends to tell us, and then what some of the different periodization approaches are, so that if you're a coach, hopefully this is kind of a nice refresher maybe. And then if you're a self-coach athlete, it's kind of starting to open your eyes into the world of periodization, what some of these terms are surrounding periodization, and then what it means to have a periodized approach to training versus a non-periodized approach to training. Because a lot of athletes just kind of take that random, unstructured approach. And again, it's not necessarily wrong, especially if you're just training kind of for fun and you aren't maybe trying to improve your performances each year. If you're just in it for fun and for the enjoyment of it, or for just the general health and fitness aspects of it, depending on how much you're training and how serious you are about that training, having an unstructured and random approach might be the best thing for you if that's all you're doing it for, is just for the fun of it and for the joy of it, and you're not training that much. An unstructured approach might work best for you. But a periodized approach or a structured approach to training is probably best for most athletes if they're trying to be competitive and if they're trying to improve their performance year in, year out, while at the same time trying to maximize the improvements that they are seeing in their fitness. That's where a periodization approach really starts to become superior. So hopefully this was useful for you, whether you're a coach or an athlete. And again, hopefully it helps bridge the gap between what science tends to tell us and how we apply that science to the training that we do as endurance athletes, or the coaching that we do as endurance coaches. So again, any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. If you want more detail on this, be sure to click on that link that I include in the show notes below. That'll take you to the piece that I wrote in our VO2 Max forum, and you'll get a little bit more detail and depth of information in there. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to joining you guys again on our next podcast episode. Until then, happy training and racing. Cheers. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.